Ever heard about MacArthur Wheeler, the guy who robbed a bank? He thought lemon juice would make him, invisible to cameras. So it's such a strange story, but it kind of sparked some pretty interesting research. Like, why do people think they're better at things than they actually are? That research led to something called the Dunning-Kruger Effect. It's this cognitive bias thing where people, who weren't very good at something, they think they're amazing. And then the opposite happens too. Like really skilled people, sometimes they underestimate themselves. So the Dunning-Kruger effect, where did it come from? Well, back in 1999, two psychologists, David Dunning and Justin Kruger, they were at Cornell University. You know, that lemon juice story. They were fascinated by it. And they did all these experiments. They wanted to figure out how people see themselves compared to how they actually perform. They looked at things like logic, grammar, even humor. And what they found was, well, pretty surprising. The people who scored the lowest, like the bottom 25%, they consistently thought they were way better than they were. Like, way better. They thought they were above average, but they were actually, at the bottom of the barrel. One test, they had people who scored in the 12th percentile, and they actually thought they were in the 62nd percentile. That's a big difference, right? And here's the thing. The opposite was also true. The people who were really good at something, they often thought, well, everyone must be this good. It's almost like the less you know, the more confident you are, the more you know, the more you realize there's so much more to learn. So what explains this? Why does this happen? One big thing is something called metacognition. It's basically, the ability to think about your own thinking. And the research suggests that people who aren't good at something, they lack the skills to accurately judge their own performance. Like they just don't have the tools to, see the gap between how they see themselves and the reality of the situation. Imagine like you're trying to find spelling errors in your writing, but you're not good at grammar. You might actually think you're a great speller just because you don't even know you're making mistakes. There's another way to think about the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's like a confidence ladder. Picture like a ladder with different rungs, and each rung represents a different level of skill. At the bottom, people have, limited knowledge, and they tend to think they're more competent than they actually are. They just haven't grasped how complex the subject really is, so they can't accurately assess their own, position. But as you climb the ladder, you gain more experience, more knowledge. You start to see the bigger picture, and your self-perception becomes more accurate. Then at the very top, you have the real experts. And what's interesting is they often underestimate themselves. They think, well, everyone must know this. They've been so immersed in the subject for so long, they don't realize how specialized their knowledge is. But the Dunning-Kruger effect, it's not just some, abstract concept. You see it everywhere. Think about that person who reads a few articles online and suddenly they think they're a financial guru giving everyone investment advice. Or that amateur cook who watches a couple of cooking shows and thinks they're ready for MasterChef. That's classic Dunning-Kruger, right? And of course, we can't forget about the internet. The digital age, especially with social media, it's like a breeding ground for the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's so easy to access information, so people mistake that for expertise. Like you do a quick Google search, watch a few YouTube videos, and boom, you feel like you've mastered something. But you've barely scratched the surface. And this can be dangerous, especially with things like health, science, politics, like we all saw those self-proclaimed health experts during COVID, spreading misinformation about vaccines and treatments, even though they had no medical training. And that highlights something important. The Dunning-Kruger effect isn't just about not knowing enough. It's about not realizing that you don't know enough. And that leads to, overconfidence, which can have serious consequences. Another thing that makes the Dunning-Kruger effect worse online is those echo chambers. Social media algorithms, they show you content that you already agree with. You're in this bubble where your opinions are constantly reinforced, even if they're based on, wrong information. It's a vicious cycle, right? You get more and more confident, but it's all based on false beliefs. Think about political echo chambers. People only see opinions that agree with their biases, so they start to think their perspective is the only right one. And that lack of exposure to different viewpoints, well, it can stifle critical thinking. It can lead to, polarization. But it's not just online. The Dunning-Kruger effect can mess things up in the workplace too. Imagine a new employee who thinks they're more capable than they are. They take on a task that's too much for them. What happens? Mistakes, missed deadlines, and it could cost the company money. Or think about a manager who's overconfident. They don't see their own limitations, they make bad decisions, and they don't appreciate the people on their team who are actually stalled. This kind of thing can lead to, bad choices, low morale, and it can really hurt the company. And here's something else. The Dunning-Kruger effect can actually prevent people from growing professionally. If you think you're already an expert, why would you bother with training or feedback? You just become closed-minded, and that stops you from reaching your full potential. It's a cycle of stagnation. So we've talked about the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people overestimate themselves. But there's also the opposite, something called imposter syndrome. This is when really confident people constantly doubt their abilities. They're afraid of being exposed as frauds, even though they're not. They might downplay their accomplishments, say they were just lucky, or worry that people will find out they're not as good as they seem. It's like they're so aware of how much they still don't know that they underestimate their own expertise. So it's interesting, right? Dunning-Kruger leads to inflated self-perception, and imposter syndrome leads to deflated self-perception. Both of these show us just how complex the relationship is between competence and self-awareness. So the big question is, how do we deal with this? How do we break free from overconfidence or crippling self-doubt? That's what we'll explore next. The good news is the Dunning-Kruger effect, it's not, a life sentence or anything. There are definitely ways to overcome it and get a better sense of, what we're good at and what we need to work on. One of the most important things is self-awareness. It's about taking a step back and really looking at ourselves honestly. What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? We all have blind spots, areas where we might think we're better than we actually are. One thing that can help is setting goals, like specific, measurable goals, and then tracking our progress. That way we can compare what we thought would happen with what actually happened. It can be humbling, for sure, but it's also really eye-opening. When we see the evidence right there in front of us, we can start to close that gap between how we see ourselves and reality. Another really crucial thing is feedback. Getting feedback from other people, especially people who are more experienced than us. I know it can be tough to hear criticism, but it's so important. Constructive criticism, it's not about putting us down, it's about helping us grow. We need to create environments where feedback is welcomed, like it's a gift, not an attack. And when we get feedback, we need to listen, really try to understand what the other person is saying. They might see things that we don't, and that can help us identify our blind spots. It's not just about individual effort, though, right? Like the way we design learning environments or online platforms, that can make a big difference, too. Imagine online courses that have quizzes built in through the whole thing. Those quizzes can give you immediate feedback, so you know if you're on the right track or if you need to go back and review something. Or what about online communities that encourage, fact-checking and respectful debate? Platforms could highlight sources that are credible. They could teach people how to evaluate information. They could even, reward users for having thoughtful discussions instead of just spreading misinformation. Okay, let's talk about something specific where the Dunning-Kruger effect can have a big impact, the financial markets. Investing, it can seem really complicated at first, but once people learn the basics, they might start to get a little overconfident. Especially nowadays, with all the information available online and those trading platforms. They see some stocks go up, read a few headlines, and suddenly they think they're the next Warren Buffett, right? They start taking bigger risks, ignoring expert advice, falling for those get-rich-quick schemes. And it's all driven by this confidence that's not really based on a deep understanding of the market. And it's not just beginners either. Even experienced investors, they can fall into the trap of overconfidence, especially if they've been successful in the past. There's actually research on this, and they call it the error of calibration of the incompetence. Basically, people who aren't very good at something, they way overestimate their abilities. And then on the other hand, you have highly confident people who actually underestimate themselves. That's the error of calibration of the highly confident. It's pretty fascinating, right? Even experts can be affected by these cognitive biases. So it just shows you how important it is to always be questioning ourselves, to be willing to admit that we might be wrong no matter how much experience we have. So how can investors protect themselves from the Dunning-Kruger effect? Well, first of all, they need to understand that investing is a complex field. It takes constant learning and a good dose of humility. Don't assume you know everything, even if you've made some money. The market's always changing. There's always more to learn. It's a good idea to get advice from financial professionals, to diversify your investments, and to stick to a long-term strategy. Don't make impulsive decisions based on overconfidence. Remember, slow and steady wins the race, right? Now, here's something interesting. Some research actually suggests that the Dunning-Kruger effect might not always be a bad thing. In some situations, a little bit of overconfidence can actually be helpful. Like, think about someone starting a new business. They need to believe in their vision, in their abilities. That confidence might be exactly what they need to push through the tough times and succeed. Of course, this doesn't mean being reckless or ignoring all advice, but a little bit of optimism, a little bit of self-belief, combined with a realistic assessment of the risks, that could be really powerful. It's about finding the right balance, being aware of our limits, but still believing in ourselves. Okay, so now you might be thinking, wait, am I falling for this Dunning-Kruger thing? It's tough to know for sure, right? Because one of the tricky things about this bias is we don't always realize we have it. It's like trying to see your own blind spots. But hey, just by knowing about the Dunning-Kruger effect, you're already doing better than a lot of people. It means you're starting to think critically about, what you know and what you don't know. And originally those things we talked about before, like being self-aware, getting feedback, always trying to learn new things, those are all super important. They can really help you stay grounded and not get too overconfident. There's this model. It's called the 4 stages of competence. It kind of explains how our view of our own abilities changes as we, learn and gain experience. The first stage is unconscious incompetence. Basically, this is where you don't even realize you're bad at something. You don't know what you don't know. It's like the perfect breeding ground for the Dunning-Kruger effect. You're just blissfully ignorant. But then, as you start learning about something new, you move into the second stage, conscious incompetence. This stage can be a little bit uncomfortable because you start to realize how much you don't know. It can be a bit overwhelming, but it's an important stage because it makes you want to improve, right? You start looking for knowledge, trying to get better. And if you keep practicing and working hard, you'll eventually get to the third stage, conscious competence. Now, you actually have the skills, but you still have to focus and put in effort to do them well. It's like you're not in the dark anymore, but you're not quite a master yet. And finally, you reach the top, unconscious competence. This is where it all comes together. You've mastered the skill so well that it's basically automatic. You can do it without even thinking about it. Like, think of a really good musician. They can play their instrument perfectly without even looking at the music. They've reached this level of expertise where it's just natural and instinctive for them. This model, it reminds us that learning is a journey, It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes humility. We all start at the bottom and we have to work our way up. And embracing that journey, the ups and downs, that's how we grow. So, what does this mean for you? I mean, we all need to accept that we're always learning, always growing. Be open to new things, question what you think you know, and look for different perspectives. Remember, becoming an expert takes time. And be kind to yourself along the way. We all make mistakes, and that's okay. Those mistakes can teach us a lot. Next time you feel like you're the expert on something, just take a second to think, are you really as knowledgeable as you think you are? Or could this Dunning-Kruger thing be messing with you? Remember, knowing what you don't know, that's not a weakness. It's actually a side of wisdom. It's the first step towards learning, understanding, and making better choices in this crazy, complicated world. And hey, maybe by admitting what we don't know, we can avoid ending up like MacArthur Wheeler, the lemon juice bank robber. He's kind of a cautionary tale about what happens when overconfidence goes too far.